What if the most powerful healer in a hospital didn't wear a white coat, but carried a rusty cart filled with wood and silence? In this deeply moving story, we follow Gus, an elderly carpenter whose quiet presence goes unnoticed by most, but whose handmade therapy rooms begin to transform the lives of children, one carved beam at a time. What starts in the basement of a Colorado hospital becomes a nationwide movement of healing, shaped not by fame but by love and listening. If you're looking for a story that speaks to the heart, one that lingers long after the final word, stay with us. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful human-centered storytelling. And after you've heard Gus's journey, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. What part of this story touched you most? Now, let's begin. The Man with the Rusty Cart. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or real-life events is purely coincidental. The characters, settings, and events have been created solely for the purpose of storytelling and are intended to convey moral lessons, inspiration, and emotional insight. This video is not intended to provide professional medical, psychological, or therapeutic advice. Viewer discretion is advised for sensitive themes. We encourage viewers to reflect on the story's message and use it as a source of motivation, learning, and personal growth. In a quiet corner of a children's hospital in Colorado, an elderly black carpenter named Gus arrives each morning pushing a squeaky, rusted cart filled with worn tools. To many, he's invisible, just a quiet man in the background. But behind his silence lies a gift. Gus builds wooden therapy spaces that calm frightened children, ease pain, and bring peace where medicine cannot. His handcrafted rooms begin to transform not just the hospital, but lives. As word spreads, his designs inspire a movement across the country. Yet Gus never seeks attention. He simply listens, carves, and heals, one room, one child, one moment at a time. The Man with the Rusty Cart is a moving story about the power of care, the dignity of craft, and how even the quietest hands can leave behind a legacy that changes everything. Before the sunrise colored the Rockies and long before the morning shift filled the corridors of Centennial Children's Hospital, a squeak echoed softly through the back hallways. It was a rhythmic sound, unmistakable to those who noticed it, a weary wheel rubbing against rust, drawn along with quiet purpose. Augustus Martin, known to no one as such but called simply Gus by the single nurse who ever thought to ask his name, arrived every morning the same way. One hand gripping the handle of a battered cart, the other holding a thermos wrapped in chipped navy paint. His cart was the color of old rain, its metal warped and spotted with flecks of orange corrosion. Inside it, wooden tools rubbed against each other like old friends, mallets, planes, chisels, and hand-carved levels that bore the marks of decades of honest work. He walked slowly, favoring his left knee. A faded patch on the knee of his overalls told the story of an old injury. His boots were so worn they had molded to the shape of his feet. He never wore a watch, yet always arrived at 5:30 sharp, pushing open the side door near the loading dock with a shoulder and a sigh. Hospital staff barely noticed him. Some thought he was part of maintenance, though no one could recall who hired him. He wore no badge but carried a laminated card that was so smudged and faded it could have been anything. A building pass, an old ID, maybe a volunteer credential issued years ago and since forgotten by whoever kept the records. Most mornings, Gus made his way to the underused corners of the hospital. The staff break room with a crooked table, the family waiting lounge with a splintering bench, or the chapel door whose knob had long been loose. He moved with the patience of someone who had seen things break 100 different ways and knew that everything, with care, could be made whole again. The pediatric floor held his quiet attention the longest. Children passed through like seasons, some for a few days, others for months. Gus never asked why they were there. He just noticed the details: the wobble of a crib rail, the sharp edge of a shelf near the play area, a coat hook that drooped under the weight of a nurse's purse. And he fixed them. He worked without interruption, his cart nestled in a corner like a faithful dog. When he was finished, he left behind more than mended wood. He left birds, stars, whales, and tiny sleeping foxes carved from pine or maple, smoothed to velvet by sandpaper and time. He placed them on windowsills and beside children's pillows, always in pairs or trios, as if the little creatures were keeping each other company. The children began to call the animals window friends. One girl, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, swore the wooden bird outside her window moved when she was asleep. Another child carried a carved bear everywhere, clutching it through appointments and meals like a shield. But the adults? Most hardly noticed the toys or the man who made them. The janitorial crew nodded politely. Nurses occasionally offered him coffee when the machine was full. But no one asked what he was doing with a chisel in the hallway. No one asked why he spent 3 days sanding and shaping a single rocking chair, or how he managed to install a row of wooden pegs shaped like giraffes without touching a hospital blueprint. He didn't seek permission. He didn't ask for thanks. To Gus, the work was enough. Every whittled edge was a quiet offering. Every polished surface a kind of prayer. One morning, when snow laced the windows and fog softened the Denver skyline, he arrived to find a toy chest had broken in the trauma recovery room. Not just cracked. A jagged split had run through the side like a bolt of lightning. A nurse named Clara had taped a sign over it that read, "Do not use." Broken. Gus peeled the tape away without a word. By the time the sun was high and the lunch carts were rolling, the chest was not just mended but transformed. Where once there had been plain birch paneling, now there were soft hills carved into the sides, tiny foxes peeking through etched trees, and handles shaped like clouds. He varnished the entire piece by hand and left it to dry near a vent. That afternoon, Clara found it and stood frozen for several seconds, her tray of folders balanced in her arms. She crouched down, fingers brushing over the fine grain. Then she looked up the hallway. He was already gone. But the children noticed. They always noticed. They whispered stories about the man with the cart, about how he was part magician, part grandpa, part tree spirit. One boy claimed Gus could talk to the wood and it whispered back. A nurse laughed it off, calling it a side effect of the medication. But the boy had been off meds for 2 days. And that night, as snow fell in velvet silence outside the wide hospital windows, a child with a carved bear tucked into his blanket slept without nightmares for the first time in weeks. The storm rolled in heavy and dark one Wednesday morning, dragging behind it a sky full of wet, slate-colored clouds. Gus walked the long stretch from the bus stop to the hospital with the collar of his coat turned up and a tarp stretched over his cart. Wind tugged at the edges, but he kept going, slower than usual, head bent against the cold. Inside Centennial Children's Hospital, the heat clicked and hissed in the vents while staff shuffled into their routines. The power had flickered overnight. Some of the automatic doors were stuck. One of the elevators refused to open past the second floor. Everyone was rushing. Gus moved in the opposite rhythm, steady and quiet. He made his way to the trauma wing. There was a playroom at the far end, room 317. It used to be a bright space full of plastic toys and beanbags, but the colors had faded, and the soundproofing never worked right. Therapists brought children there to help them talk about the things that hurt, but the room itself was a kind of hurt. Too loud, too bright, too sharp. That morning, the new trauma therapist arrived early. Her name was Dr. Sonia Keller. She was from Atlanta originally, but her voice had softened to match the mountain air. She had been at the hospital just 2 weeks. She wore simple clothes, wire-frame glasses, and a pendant shaped like a raindrop around her neck. She had noticed Gus before, once in the hallway, once near the elevators. She had nodded. He had nodded back. Nothing more. But that day, as she passed the trauma room and caught sight of the old man sanding something in the corner, she paused. He was crouched low, smoothing a wooden panel with slow, precise strokes, dust gathering around his boots. "Excuse me," she said. Gus looked up. His eyes were dark, thoughtful. He nodded once, setting the block of wood aside. "I've seen you around," she said. "Are you with maintenance?" He shook his head. "Volunteer." He tilted his head in a way that meant maybe, maybe not. She smiled. "You working on something for this room?" He reached into the cart and pulled out a sketch. Not a blueprint, not a formal drawing, just lines made with a soft pencil on brown craft paper. A forest, rough and simple, with tall trees curving around the edges of a room. The floor was meant to resemble planks. There were low shelves shaped like branches. In the middle, a round wooden table stood like a stump, ringed by animal-shaped seats. Dr. Keller took the paper gently. "You drew this?" He nodded. She looked back at the playroom. The cracked linoleum, the mismatched plastic chairs, the chipped primary color bins that felt like they belonged in a discount store. Then she looked back at the drawing. "May I help?" she asked. Gus blinked, surprised. Then he motioned to a clean rag and a second sanding block. She knelt beside him and began to work. That afternoon, she canceled her other sessions. She called in a few favors. She asked for permission, not from the hospital board, but from the children. 4 of them, all under 10, came to see the drawing. One of them touched the part with the carved owl and said, "Can we live in there?" Sonia smiled. "Not live, but maybe visit when things feel hard." They nodded solemnly. Over the next 2 weeks, Gus transformed the room. The old carpet came up and was replaced with sealed, natural oak panels that felt like a forest floor. He built shelves with gentle curves, no sharp edges, and lined the back wall with carved trees, some etched with animals so subtle they looked like secrets. The walls became a muted green, washed in warm light from hanging lanterns shaped like mushrooms. He built a bench in the shape of a sleeping fox, a chair with antlers that children could hang their backpacks on, a window seat tucked into the far corner, covered in thick cushions stitched with forest leaves. The final touch was a ceiling mobile. Wooden birds carved with feathered wings, hung by invisible threads, each one spinning slowly in the air currents. Dr. Keller watched as the first group of children entered. They stopped talking. One reached out to touch the wooden bark. Another sat quietly on the fox bench and began to hum to herself. In their next session, one of them, a 6-year-old girl who had not spoken since the accident, pointed at the owl carving and whispered, "He's watching to make sure I'm safe." The next week, a boy with night terrors slept through an entire session curled beneath the tree mural. Word spread. Teachers, therapists, and administrators visited. Some offered compliments. Others asked who had designed the room. A few assumed it had been imported, that some high-end company had built it off-site. When Dr. Keller said it was made by the man with the cart, they looked confused. Who? The old man who comes in through the side door. Augustus Martin. Most of them shrugged. The name meant nothing. But the room, people remembered the room. Patients asked to visit even when they weren't scheduled for therapy. Nurses began using it as a calming space before procedures. Some said it felt like the room itself was breathing. Dr. Keller found Gus one afternoon sanding a new stool shaped like a turtle. "I think this is more than therapy," she said. He looked up, puzzled. "It's healing," she said. "What you built. I think we should talk about sharing it." Gus paused, then returned to sanding. Dr. Keller didn't push. She understood. Some people healed in silence. Some people built what they could not say. Still, she made a note in her journal that night. Room 317, therapy success rate plus 28%. New referrals based solely on patient preference. Recommend documentation and proposal for expanded use. Also, find out what other rooms Gus has worked on. By the time spring reached Denver and the snow melted into the gutters, Room 317 had become a quiet legend. The trauma ward was seeing a subtle shift. Nothing loud, nothing in press releases or meetings. But the children were changing. Nurses noticed first. They whispered to each other between rounds over coffee mugs and vending machine snacks. "Have you seen how fast Jeremy settled today? Did you hear Mia laughed again in the forest room?" They never said Room 317 anymore. It was just the forest room. Downstairs in administration there were questions, but no one had answers. The hospital director had walked by Room 317 once, glanced inside, and muttered something about safety compliance. But the room passed every inspection. Every piece of wood had been sanded smooth. Every corner rounded. Every fixture secured without nails or metal edges. It was, against all odds, perfect. Yet the man who made it remained unknown to most. In the staff lounge on the 4th floor, a group of younger doctors sat around a table strewn with clipboards and uneaten granola bars. One of them, Dr. Imran, spoke while tapping his pen against a cup. "I'm telling you, I've been here 6 months and never seen him clock in or out. No ID. No work orders." A nurse named Lila raised her brow. "Gus? He's been here longer than most of the board." "Yeah, but what's his title? Who hired him?" No one could answer. So they guessed. Maybe he's part of a legacy grant. Some kind of special volunteer program? Retired master craftsman doing community service. Probation. They got a laugh. The truth was, Gus had no title. Years ago, a hospital director, long since retired, had quietly added him to a now-defunct neighborhood partnership for skilled tradesmen. He had fixed a warped floor in the neonatal unit, then carved a small set of animal figures for the parents' lounge. One director after another forgot to cancel his access. And Gus never stopped showing up. Dr. Sonia Keller, meanwhile, was keeping notes. Every patient who spent time in the forest room was charted and tracked. Their reactions, behavior, cortisol levels, even post-session feedback. She compiled it all in a growing file labeled G. Martin Therapeutic Environment Model. She approached the hospital's development office with a proposal to expand the design to a second room, this one for long-term chemotherapy patients. A calming space with nature elements, hand-built furnishings, sensory features. Everything Gus had created, but scaled. The administrator, a sharp woman in a tailored blazer, looked at the proposal and said, "Who's the vendor?" Sonia blinked. "He's not a vendor. He's here. In the building." "Oh, so he's an artist in residence?" "No. He's Gus. The administrator smiled politely and slid the proposal aside. We'll need formal bids if we move forward. Sonia left the meeting frustrated but undeterred. She knew better than to wait for permission. That night, she found Gus in the sublevel hallway where the janitor's closet met the disused mail chute. He was oiling a rocking horse, small, sturdy, and carved with vines along the handles. She knelt beside him and said, "They want bids. I think you should let me document your process. We can submit your work as a proposal. Not just for here. For everywhere." He didn't answer. He just kept oiling the wood. "I know you're not doing this for attention," she said softly, "but it's helping people. What if your rooms could help children in other hospitals? Not everyone has a Gus." Still no reply. She stood to leave but paused. "I'm going to write the proposal anyway. Even if they ignore it. Even if you don't show up for the meetings." Gus looked up. His hand stilled. "I don't talk in meetings." "I'll talk," she said. "You just keep building." He nodded. Over the following month, word of the forest room reached the family of a former patient, a mother who ran a parenting blog with a large following. She wrote a piece titled "The Treehouse That Saved My Son." It described the day her 7-year-old, who hadn't spoken since the accident, finally whispered, "It's okay now," while tracing his fingers over a carved owl. The blog post went viral. Local news picked it up. Photos of the room were shared, reposted, reshared. Therapists in other cities began emailing Centennial asking, "Who designed this?" At first there was no answer. Then Dr. Keller responded with a single line, "A man named Augustus Martin. He carries his tools in a rusty cart." A reporter called the hospital. Then another. A regional magazine asked for a photo shoot. Gus declined. Dr. Keller offered to be photographed instead, with the room in the background. But before the shoot, she found a new carving on the windowsill. A bird, mid-flight, wings stretched wide. On the base, in the faintest carving, were the words, "Built with listening hands." She held it during the photo shoot. The article ran the following week under the headline, "The Carpenter of Quiet Miracles." By the end of the month, 5 hospitals had reached out with interest in building rooms like Room 317. Gus never read the article. But he did start bringing more wood. He added a second shelf to his cart. The wheel still squeaked. The varnish still smelled of pine. He still arrived before dawn. The only difference was that now, some of the staff nodded to him by name. The smell of cedar and linseed oil lingered now in the hallway that led to the oncology wing. On some mornings, it overpowered even the antiseptic tang of the mop buckets. Gus had begun work on a new space, a room for children undergoing long-term treatments. Where before there had been pale walls and a few limp posters, now emerged the delicate architecture of a forest cabin. He worked alone as always, but not unseen. Over time, staff began to pause and watch. A young pediatric nurse named Mateo started bringing him water. Another, Charisse, once handed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He accepted both with a nod and a soft "thank you" that sounded like gravel being rolled smooth. Dr. Keller visited daily now. She kept her notes in a worn leather-bound journal and sometimes read aloud to him what the children were saying about the space. "They're calling it the Brave Den," she said once as he adjusted a wooden beam. One said it feels like a place where superheroes sleep between missions. Gus smiled faintly. Then he turned back to the beam, securing it with a hand-forged bracket shaped like a bear paw. In truth, each element Gus added had a purpose. The bear paw symbolized protection. The gentle curve of the window bench offered both a view of the sky and a sense of shelter. The turtle-shaped stool, low and wide, provided not just a seat but a subtle lesson in patience. It was therapy without language, storytelling without words. He saw patterns others missed. A groove in the floor might become a river trail. A knothole might bloom into the eye of a fox. The wood told him what it wanted to be. He just listened. One afternoon, while shaping a low table from walnut, a man in a suit arrived. He was tall, with a phone in one hand and a glossy folder tucked under his arm. His shoes clicked like punctuation marks on the linoleum. He approached Dr. Keller near the nurse's station. "I'm with the foundation," he said. "We're here to evaluate this therapeutic environment for replication." Sonia crossed her arms. "The model is still evolving. Augustus Martin is finalizing the third space." "Martin?" The man flipped through his folder. "We couldn't find any employment file for him. No contract. No payroll." "That's correct." He raised an eyebrow. "So he's operating unofficially?" Sonia held his gaze. "He's healing children. Official or not." The man gave a tight smile. We'll need proper documentation before we can proceed with any funding or regional adoption. Liability, you understand. Of course, she said. We'll provide all necessary records. Later that day, she found Gus fitting a rounded archway near the doorway of the Brave Den. She explained the situation, how officials wanted credentials and proof and plans with bullet points. He didn't answer right away. He sanded the underside of the arch slowly, carefully, until it was satin smooth. Then he said, "Wood doesn't care about resumes." "I know," she said, "but people do." He looked past her, toward the window where a child with a scarf around her head was drawing in a sketchbook. "I build what I know they need. If others want to learn, they're welcome. But I don't speak for the wood." That night, Sonia made a decision. If the hospital needed a formal proposal, she would write it. If they needed measurements, she would take them. If they wanted blueprints, she would trace every curve he carved. But she would not let them replace Gus with a brochure. Meanwhile, the children had begun to leave their own marks in the space. Not graffiti, not damage, just small tokens. A drawing tucked behind a carved deer. A button left beside a carved mushroom. A note slipped under the corner of the turtle stool. "I feel better here." The Brave Den opened to patients 2 weeks later. The response was immediate. Children lingered longer, spoke more freely. Therapists reported lower levels of distress during sessions. One child who had refused touch for months allowed a nurse to brush her hair for the first time. Word spread again. An architectural team from Chicago requested a virtual tour. A pediatric hospital in Oregon emailed asking for consultation. The hospital director, now aware that something rare was unfolding, called an internal meeting. For once, there was no debate. Gus was officially recognized as a therapeutic artisan in residence. The title meant little to him. He still came at the same hour, still brought his cart, still worked in silence. But something had shifted. One morning, as he approached the staff entrance, he found a small crowd waiting. Nurses, therapists, janitors, even a few doctors. They weren't blocking his way. They were just there. Some had coffee in hand. One carried a sign that read, "Thank you, Gus." He paused, nodded once. Then he pushed his cart forward, the wheel still squeaking in time with his step. Behind him, a child peeked from the playroom window. When she saw the cart, she turned to the boy beside her and whispered, "The builder's back." And the boy whispered back, "Good? The room's been lonely." Spring gave way to a soft summer. On the south lawn of Centennial Children's Hospital, the flowers planted by the Volunteer Garden Club bloomed late but bright. Marigolds, lavender, and wild roses, their colors glowing under the thin Colorado sun. From a distance, the hospital looked like any other. Clean lines, wide windows, a place of both hope and burden. Inside, however, something was happening. The Brave Den had been open just 6 weeks, and already 2 new children had asked to have their treatments moved to afternoons, so the room would have more sun. Therapists noted that sessions in the space averaged 15 minutes longer than before. Some children, usually too anxious to remain still, now curled into corners of the wooden benches and listened while their clinicians spoke. Some even spoke back. One child, a 9-year-old boy with a burn scar across his cheek, had written in crayon on a comment card, "It feels like the woods know my name." That week, Sonia Keller was invited to present at a regional health conference in Boulder. Her topic was listed as environmental design in pediatric trauma therapy, but in her folder, her slides carried a simpler title, "The Builder with the Rusty Cart." She practiced her talk late at night in the quiet of her office. She flipped through photographs, each showing a detail: the owl carved into the corner panel, the bare shelf, the slow-turning wooden birds. In one slide, Gus stood in silhouette at the doorway of the Brave Den. The light hit him just right, and his shadow stretched across the wooden floor like a figure in a storybook. She left that photo for last. When she presented, the room was full. Psychologists, pediatricians, designers, architects. Many were skeptical at first. One raised his hand halfway through and asked, "Are you saying children recover faster just because a room has wood and carved animals?" "No," Sonia replied. "I'm saying that children heal more freely when the space speaks to them in ways adults often forget." Gus doesn't build rooms. He builds invitations. There was a pause, then murmurs, then quiet nods. After the presentation, a small group waited to speak with her. One woman from Seattle said, "We've been looking for something like this for years. Not just distraction therapy. Real environment-based healing." Another, from a children's clinic in Santa Fe, asked, "Is there any way we can learn from him?" Sonia hesitated. "He's not a teacher, not in the traditional sense. He doesn't lecture or Zoom. He works with his hands. He listens more than he speaks. The woman smiled. Then maybe we should send someone to listen. Back at the hospital, Gus was finishing a new piece for the neonatal unit, a curved wooden cradle built into a bench with soft edges and hand-rubbed finish. On its back was a carved scene, a mother deer and her fawn, curled in sleep. As he placed it in the sunroom, a young mother in scrubs came to sit nearby. Her baby, only weeks old, was in an oxygen crib just beyond the glass. She didn't say much, just looked at the cradle, then at him, then back to the cradle. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Gus nodded, then knelt to adjust the level of the legs. The woman watched him for a while, then said quietly, "I didn't think I'd make it through this. Then I saw this room. I saw what you made. I thought, if someone can make something so kind, maybe the world still holds something good." He didn't reply. But after she left, he stayed kneeling by the bench a little longer than usual. The next day, Sonia returned from the conference. She brought with her a proposal, official, detailed, with funding support already lined up. The idea was simple: build 3 more therapeutic spaces based on Gus's designs, in 3 hospitals across the state. Use local artisans. Let Gus guide the forms. No lectures. No contracts. Just hands and wood and stories waiting to be carved. She found him in the basement hallway again, sorting through planks. "They're ready," she said. "They want to build what you build. Not copy it. Not mass-produce it. Just learn. I told them you wouldn't do interviews or Zoom calls. They said okay." He didn't look up. "I can go in your place," she said. "Show them the rooms. Show them what the children did. I can tell them what it meant." He paused, then looked at her with eyes that had seen more than she could name. "You want to take the forest," he said, "and plant it other places." She nodded. "Yes." Gus reached into his cart and pulled out a folded sheet of craft paper. It was worn and smudged but intact. He handed it to her. Inside was a sketch, part forest, part stream, part cavern. A new room. A space that didn't yet exist. "Tell them," he said, "this is where it begins." That night, Sonia wrote the proposal's final line. "Healing does not begin with medicine. Sometimes it begins with a hand-carved bench in a room that whispers, 'You are safe now.'" And Gus, the man with the rusty cart, continued to build. The first replication site was a children's clinic in Durango, nestled in the southwest corner of the state where red rock met alpine pine. It was a small facility with no budget for architects, only a will to try something different. Sonia had visited twice, spoken to the staff, walked the space that would become their version of the Brave Den. They gave her a blank room with flickering lights and linoleum floors. She brought them sketches drawn by Gus. She showed them photos and whispered stories told by children who had cried less, talked more, or simply stayed longer in the spaces he made. Then she called Gus. "I'm not asking you to go," she said. "I just want you to know they're starting. They've hired 2 local carpenters. One of them's a woman named Rosita. She said she's never built for children before. She wants to know how you decide what shape a bench should be." There was a long pause on the other end. "Then, tell her to sit where they sit. The shape comes after that." That became the rule. Wherever new rooms were built, carpenters first had to sit, on the floor by the window under the weight of silence. Only then could they begin. Back in Denver, Gus continued his quiet rhythm. But something had changed in the hospital. Not in the rooms, those were still his sanctuaries, but in the people. More staff began to stop and ask him questions. They didn't ask about the wood. They asked about the children. "Do you think Mia would like a fox carved in her room?" a therapist asked. "Should I move the rocking chair closer to the window for Caleb? How did you know I shall like birds?" He never gave direct answers. Instead, he'd walk into the room, sit down beside them and watch. Listen. Sometimes he would close his eyes. Sometimes he would touch the wall or the edge of a shelf. Then, slowly he would begin to work. One day, a small group of visiting doctors from Washington State walked through the Brave Den with Dr. Keller. They marveled at the details, the layered tree canopy carved into the ceiling, the feel of the wooden floor under their shoes, the subtle echo of bird calls played through hidden speakers. "It's emotional," one of them said. "It's precise," said another. "Therapeutic design through lived intuition." Sonia nodded but said, "It's more than design. Gus builds in response to what he hears in silence." That same afternoon, Sonia returned to her office and found Gus waiting outside the door, his cart parked beside him. He held a small wooden box in his hands. No lid, just a smooth open top. Inside were carvings, tiny pieces shaped like leaves, animals, stars, and stones. "For the children to take," he said. She looked at them, running her finger over a carved crescent moon. To remember what helped them? He shook his head. To remind them they were never alone. She placed the box in her office, and each child who came through the brave den from that day forward chose one token to carry home. No one was told what to choose. They simply knew. One nurse called them anchor pieces. Another called them pocket hope. By the end of summer, 5 hospitals had created their own versions of Gus's rooms. Not copies. Interpretations. Each bore signs of the carpenter's silent influence. Rounded corners, nature carved in unexpected places, benches low enough for children to sit with their knees hugged to their chest. In Fort Collins, a child on the autism spectrum who hadn't made eye contact in months reached out to touch the carved waves of a wall panel. His mother wept. In Pueblo, a teenager facing her 3rd round of leukemia therapy asked to be left alone in their new quiet room. 45 minutes later, she walked out and said, "I'm ready now." The media tried to catch up. Articles ran. Interviews were requested. Awards were offered. Gus declined all of them. Sonia took the awards on his behalf, but she never pretended to speak for him. She quoted him only when he allowed it, and even then only once. She stood at a national pediatric care summit in front of hundreds of experts and said, "He told me this. Children already know how to heal. Sometimes we just need to make them a space where they can remember." That was the day the state of Colorado offered to name him an honorary master in therapeutic craft. He didn't respond. But he did bring a new stool to the brave den the following week, round, low, and carved with the outlines of 3 small hands. No names, just the prints. The room changed again that month. Not in shape but in spirit. Children began calling it the Healing Woods. They spoke of dreams they had while resting there. One said he heard the trees whisper goodnight. Another claimed she met her grandfather in the corner where the carved deer stood. Doctors shook their heads. Nurses smiled knowingly. And Gus kept building. Late in the season, Sonia found him standing alone in the nearly finished sanctuary being added to the grief counseling wing. This one was different. Darker wood, quieter tones, fewer animal carvings, and more sky motifs. "You knew what this room was before I even told you," she said. He ran his hand along the frame of a tall, arching window. "They won't come here to play," he said, "but they still need to feel safe." She watched him for a long time, then asked, "How do you know what they need? Really?" He looked down at his hands, rough and knotted with age, then out the window toward the twilight-streaked mountains. "Because once," he said, "I needed it too. And nobody built it for me." Snow returned to the foothills before the year was done. A thin, glinting frost settled each morning along the gutters of Centennial Children's Hospital, clinging to windows and hushing the early chatter of the city. The season dulled the color of most things, but not the brave den. Inside, the room seemed to grow warmer by the day. Wood darkened with use, gaining a sheen from the touch of hundreds of hands. The carved animals now bore the polish of familiarity. Children spoke of them as companions, not decorations. Some even gave them names: Nina the fox, Mr. Owl, Big Turtle. The space had a memory of its own now, and the memory was alive. Gus noticed the change the way a tree might notice its roots pushing deeper. Slowly, surely, with no need for words. He spent most mornings refining the sanctuary in the grief counseling wing. Here the grain of the wood curled like smoke. No carvings of animals in this space. Just stars, slow-turning spirals, and arched beams that made the ceiling feel like the inside of a cathedral carved from a single tree. One morning he arrived to find a man sitting on the floor in that room. Not a child, not a nurse. A father. Eyes red. Shoulders slack. Gus did not speak. He set his tools down quietly, checked the joints on a low bench, and began smoothing the edge of a curved panel. The father didn't leave. He didn't speak either. He just sat there, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. When he finally rose, he nodded to Gus once and whispered, "Thank you." That was all. But it was enough. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Letters began to arrive, not addressed to the hospital, but to the man with the cart or the builder in the basement. They came from parents, nurses, even children who had returned home. One was written in careful cursive by a 10-year-old girl named Callie. "Dear Mr. Gus, I remember your owl. I told him my secrets and I think he kept them safe. I'm better now. I still think about the bench where I stopped being afraid. Thank you for making a place where I could breathe." Another letter from a mother in Grand Junction. "I never got your name when you worked near the NICU, but my son slept better after we sat in your little wooden room. You gave us peace we didn't know we were missing." Gus kept the letters in a shoebox under his bench in the workshop. He didn't read them all at once. He wasn't a man for praise, but he understood the weight of words. And in every thank you, he heard a child's voice echoing through the walls he had shaped. Then, near the end of winter, Sonia brought news that made him pause. "They want to build a national model," she said. "Hospitals from across the country have asked to be part of it. Not a franchise, not a company, just a network of rooms like these, spaces that listen." Gus sat on his stool, brushing sawdust from his knees. "They want you to be the face of it," she added. "The founding voice." He said nothing for a long time. Then finally, "Wood doesn't need a face." "But the children do," Sonia said softly. "They need to know someone built these rooms for them. That it wasn't luck. It was love." That night, she found a new note tucked under her office door. Not typed. Just a line written in pencil on plain paper. "Let them build. But tell them this: never carve what you haven't heard first." It became the motto of the initiative. Across the country, the movement began. Hospitals gathered teams of artists, therapists, and caregivers. Carpenters and woodworkers studied the rooms Gus had built. Not to replicate, but to listen. Each space came out different, shaped by the people and children it would serve. In St. Louis, a sea room with waves carved into the walls. In Asheville, a treehouse loft for children who needed height to feel free. In Tucson, a desert sanctuary with warm stone and sun-shaped windows. And yet, in each of them there was something of Gus. The grain, the stillness, the echo of care. Back in Denver, Gus continued to arrive each morning with his cart. The wheels still squeaked. His gait was slower now, but his hands were just as steady. One day, he walked into the Brave Den and found a child sitting cross-legged on the floor with a block of wood in her lap and a carving knife in her hand. A nurse watched from nearby but didn't interfere. The girl looked up. "I want to make something that helps people feel okay," she said. Gus knelt beside her, examined her grip on the blade, then adjusted her thumb gently. "Start with a shape," he said. "Then listen to what it wants to be." And together they carved. Outside, the snow had begun to melt. A faint stream trickled past the parking lot, fed by the thaw on the roof. Spring was near. But inside the hospital, in rooms shaped by wood and silence, healing was already in bloom. The man with the rusty cart would never ask for recognition. He had never needed applause. What he had built now stretched across the country, but more than that, it lived in the quiet moments where a child closed their eyes and felt safe. And in that stillness, the wood remembered. It always did. The end. Here are 7 moral lessons that can be drawn from this story. 1. True impact does not require recognition. In a world that often equates success with visibility, accolades, and applause, Gus reminds us that real impact can happen quietly, away from the spotlight. He never sought awards or interviews. He did not brand his work or capitalize on the acclaim it eventually received. Instead, he measured success by the stillness in a child's breath, the ease in their shoulders, the comfort in their gaze. His work was never about himself. It was always about others, about giving something of value to those who needed it most. Gus teaches us that when our intention is pure, when our work is driven by care instead of ego, the results will speak on our behalf. Recognition may come, but it should never be the reason we begin. 2. Healing begins in spaces that feel safe. The rooms Gus built weren't just beautiful, they were sanctuaries. Every curve, every carving, every grain of wood was chosen with care, not for decoration but for meaning. Children, many of them scared and hurting, found calm in those spaces because they were designed to meet emotional needs that medicine alone could not reach. Gus understood what science is only now beginning to prove, that physical environments influence psychological healing. He didn't need data to tell him that a carved owl or a beam shaped like a tree limb could soothe a child's fear. He knew it because he listened. And through him, we learned that to truly help someone, we must first make them feel safe. 3. Listening is the first step to understanding. Gus was not a man of many words, but he was always listening. To the children, to the spaces, to the silences in between. He didn't rush into a project with assumptions or formulas. He sat in the corners of rooms. He watched. He waited. He felt the weight of the room before he changed it. This kind of listening is rare. It's a listening that requires humility, patience, and attention. In our fast-paced world, we are often too quick to respond, too eager to speak. Gus teaches us that deep understanding of people, of problems, of what's truly needed, begins when we stop talking and start paying attention. 4. Kindness leaves lasting marks. Whether it was the carved fox that a child whispered her secrets to, or the crescent moon a boy carried in his pocket after leaving the hospital, Gus's work left behind symbols of safety and memory. They were small gestures, but they mattered. They endured. Children remembered. Parents remembered. Staff remembered. Kindness, when delivered with care and consistency, becomes something people carry long after they leave a place. The legacy Gus left wasn't just in wood, it was in how people felt in the spaces he shaped. That's what kindness does. It carves itself into memory, and in doing so it changes lives. 5. Everyone has something to give, no matter their past. Though the story never explicitly tells us where Gus came from, it hints at a hard past, a life in which no one built safe spaces for him. And yet, rather than grow bitter or close himself off, he chose to become the builder of what he never received. This is a powerful lesson. Pain can harden us or it can shape us into healers. Gus chose the latter. And through his choice, he teaches us that no matter where we come from or what we've endured, we all have something to give. Our scars can become tools, and our past can become a foundation for someone else's hope. 6. Dignity lives in labor done with love. There's something sacred about craftsmanship, the quiet, persistent work of hands shaping something from raw material into something meaningful. Gus's cart was rusty, his clothes worn, his back bent with age. But his work was noble. He didn't need status to possess dignity. His love for his craft and his willingness to use it in service of others gave his work more value than any title ever could. In a society that often elevates digital over physical, fast over slow, and noise over stillness, Gus reminds us that there is unmatched dignity in work done with love, patience, and integrity. 7. Legacy is not what we build for ourselves but what we build for others. By the end of the story, Gus's influence stretches far beyond Denver. Hospitals across the country begin shaping rooms inspired by his approach. Not because they wanted to copy him, but because they were moved by the spirit behind what he did. And that is what legacy truly is, not the name on the plaque but the echo of care that continues long after we're gone. Gus didn't leave behind a company or a foundation. He left behind something more enduring, an approach to healing that listens first, touches gently, and builds with love. That's what it means to leave a legacy, not to leave behind monuments but to leave behind meaning. Each of these lessons comes from observing a quiet man who chose to build sanctuary where there was none, and in doing so, helped others find peace in places once filled with fear. Gus's story is not loud. It is not dramatic. But like the rooms he built, it speaks clearly to those who are willing to listen. Thank you for watching and listening to The Man with the Rusty Cart. We hope this story brought you a moment of peace, reflection, and inspiration. If it moved you in any way, if you found comfort, meaning, or even a quiet reminder of what truly matters, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share more stories that touch the heart and spark change. And if you'd like to hear more powerful narratives like this one, be sure to check out the other videos on our channel. Each story is crafted with care to bring light, hope, and insight into the everyday lives of people who often go unseen. We'd also love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. What did this story mean to you? What moment stayed with you most? Thank you again for being here. Until next time, take care, and keep listening for the quiet stories that still have so much to say.